Now let's move on and talk about the casualties of this movement, because there were casualties in this movement, and I'll explain what I mean by casualty and the concept of a casualty in this context a little bit later. But right now I want to focus on one casualty in particular, and that was Miss Claudette Colvin. Now Claudette Colvin, as I mentioned earlier, was a teenager who 9 months before Rosa Parks was in the same city, in the same bus system, and under very, very difficult circumstances was hauled off the bus, cuffed, jailed, and really, and in many ways, when history is concerned, many of us never even knew about it. Most people have never heard of Claudette Colvin, and the rare few that have, it has been probably within the last 5 to 10 years when finding little known information on the internet has become very much a possibility. Now, as I think I mentioned before, Claudette Colvin was about 15 years old when this happened. Ironically enough, it was Negro History Month, and they had been learning about the struggles of our people, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. Because remember, those of us who were not born or not alive during this time have to really realize is we have ancestors, and so did those who came before us. We have people who were alive and kicking during the struggles of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and so on that we see as history. But the people of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s had the people that came before them that they saw as history. They were creating history, but they did not know it at the time. So at the time, this was a 15-year-old girl who simply had been subjected to too much that day. This was a young girl, a teenage girl, who had simply decided that she had had enough. And this was not the first time that she had fought oppression. It was the first time that she was arrested for it, the first time that she was jailed for it. According to Ms. Colvin, that day, she had learned more about what happened to her people, and she simply decided she had paid her money and she was not going anywhere. She was going to sit where she sat, and that was that. So after her arrest, she actually became pregnant, and many of the civil rights leaders thought that she was an inappropriate symbol for this movement, which was in many ways a test, an experiment. Not only was she pregnant as a teenager, she wasn't of means, she really didn't have a standing in the community, and during the arrest, she did resist the officer, which I bear no judgment about. More power to her, but they were trying to evoke a certain image, and they were trying to find someone who could be an icon for this movement. And Claudette Colvin did find herself in the position of not being that person. So this was not only about social class, social standing, education. That was not the only reason why they did not pick Claudette Colvin for this movement. Now, we can talk about colorism, and we can have a whole separate conversation about that, but there was a piece of colorism and featureism that played into this. Claudette Colvin was not a little light-skinned girl with long hair. Claudette Colvin was brown as me, shorter hair, and they felt that she was not necessarily visually the person that they wanted to attach to this movement, to become the icon or face of the movement. Now, here in 2020, we may look at that and say that was horrible, that was shameful, that's colorism. But what they were thinking about was all parts of the movement and who could physically represent it the best visually, and who could represented the best in terms of their reputation. And unfortunately, at that time, they did not feel that Claudette Colvin would be that person. And mind you, there were Claudette Colvins before Claudette Colvin, but her situation was so similar to Rosa Parks that this was a person who did the same action and actually did not get the recognition for it and did not become the face, quote unquote, of the civil rights movement. Not that Ms. Colvin's efforts went in vain or completely unrecognized. She actually, along with 3 other women, became the plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale, which was the first court case that eventually overturned the bus segregation laws in Montgomery. So she definitely played a part, though it wasn't a visual and visible part in the civil rights movement. But when it comes down to it, Claudette Colvin was pretty much forgotten. She's hardly ever told her story, actually. She moved out of state. She moved to New York. The community that she was in, they weren't really talking about integration. This was the community of Malcolm X, so they were talking about Black empowerment, enterprise. They weren't necessarily talking about integration. When asked years later about why everyone only thinks of Rosa Parks and no one thinks of Claudette Colvin when visualizing that part of that movement, Claudette Colvin was very, very frank. She knew it was because she was a teenager. She was an adult. They didn't think teenagers would be reliable. And it wasn't just the NAACP. It was other Black organizations that felt the same way. She stated herself that Rosa Parks had the right hair, right look. She was the skin color that people liked. She was middle class. She was all these things that I was not. Now, is that fair? Absolutely not. It was very unfair. But I want to, again, look at the concept of Umoja. Now, Claudette Colvin had a vision for her people. She had a vision for herself, but she had a vision for her people as well. So what I have not seen when I look back at the historical documentation of this time is I did not see a young Claudette Colvin coming out as a teenager, as a 20-year-old, as a 30-year-old or beyond, stating that she was wronged, that she did not get the recognition that she was supposed to get, and that recognition was given to Rosa Parks, even though she had done the same thing not too long before. I have never heard her say that, at least not in that way. She did not write a tell-all book back in 1970 about how Rosa Parks was a fraud, and Dr. Martin Luther King and E.D. Nixon and all these people who came before her who were the adults in the leader, how they did not give her her just dues. That's not something that she actually did. Now, there are, I'm sure, a number of reasons why she did not do that, but when it came down to it, it was about Umoja, it was about unity. And because she didn't do that, knowingly or unknowingly, she became the piece of the movement and the part of the unity of the movement that said, I am willing to lay down and be a casualty for the others who will become the face of this movement. And she was not the first person to do that. She would not be the last person to do that. But it is something that Claudette Colvin did. If it were not for that piece of Umoja that was in Claudette Colvin, maybe there's pieces of this movement that wouldn't have happened because it would have created divisiveness amongst this movement. So let me just give a short example. What if Claudette Colvin had said, hey, look at me, I did this first, and there is a rift between the Black teens and the rest of this movement. There is a rift between the darker skinned folk of this movement and the lighter skinned folk, between the folk of more means and the folk of less means in this movement. What if the energy that was taken in this movement had gotten rearranged? What if the energy that was taken in this movement, what if it had gotten, what if it had been diverted into, let's have an argument about who should have been the face of the movement? That may have changed the direction of the movement. So in her silence, in her prideful, classy, and self-sacrificing demeanor and action, she displayed the principle of Umoja and put her people and the struggle before her own gain. Now, I will say, again, that some might have said, well, this is what we should have been fighting for in the first place. But my point is it was what we were fighting for. It's not about whether we should or we shouldn't be fighting for integration versus not fighting for integration. It's about the fact that because you are fighting for it, and that is what the goal was, she was steadfast with that goal. She displayed the concept of Umoja. Now, the last front I needed to cover with you all today when looking at the four pieces of Umoja in this movement is the collective citizenry that made this possible. My goodness, I cannot express the amount of awe that I have for the people who were involved in this movement. These are our people. These are our ancestors. These are Black people who embody all that we need to be. And I have said this before during this video, and I will say it again. I do not care. I care not whether or not you agree or whether or not I agree with whether integration should have been the goal. These were tax-paying citizens. These were citizens who had every right to ride those buses to and fro. They had every right to ride those buses to work. So they were people who got to the point where they had had enough. And there was nothing that guaranteed that Black people would stay off of those buses. There was nothing that guaranteed it. It was announced in the Black church. Most Black people were in church at that time, so that was the place that it made sense, particularly in the South, to have this call out, if you will. They actually hoped for 60% cooperation from the people of Montgomery, of African descent, and they reached almost 100% that first day. So the question was asked, what do we do now? Should the boycott continue? And as you know, as history has told you, it has. Thousands of people, thousands turned out. They overflowed the church. They decided to continue the boycott, and the citizens of Montgomery walked. They walked, they carpooled, they were able to, before social media and internet, put together grassroots action plans on how to make sure that they're getting that they were getting from here to there. This was not just the middle-aged. This was not just the young. This was not just the old. These were the citizens. There were elderly women walking all over Montgomery, professing that their feet were tired, but their souls were rested. Their feet were tired, but their souls were rested. My goodness, I cannot say enough. I really cannot say enough. As I said earlier, there were cab drivers who were charging the same fare as the bus. City officials actually ended up announcing that it was prosecutable to charge less than 45 cents minimum fare to get on the cabs in order to discourage this, so that people were forced to get on the bus. People stayed lockstep. Hundreds of Black motorists got stopped, searched, questioned, given traffic violations. They were accosted by police officers. They were found guilty of speeding, failing to recognize red lights, caution signs. Actually, Joanne Robinson, who we discussed before, who was in the Women's Council, the Women's Political Council, she actually received 17 traffic tickets for trumped up charges that made no sense, all just to get her to ride the bus. There were death threats all over. This was not just the people that you saw in leadership. These were people who had nothing to do with leadership. These were supporters of the movement who maybe had made a statement saying that they were in favor of the movement. Cars vandalized, death threats. I cannot say enough about the people who attended bi-weekly mass meetings. Mass meetings. That means if you put everybody in one place every other week and people start to know where these people are meeting, well, the police, the Klan, anyone can see you going in and out of these places. They can see that you are running lockstep with your people in this movement. There were people trying to disseminate information that were trying to coordinate actions. And again, this is before social media, people. No one was, that's not what we were doing. It wasn't like you can just make a statement and on social media and then the worst thing that happens is your job sees it. No, people took a stand and they put their lives at risk for taking those stands. And you didn't have to be Martin Luther King for that to happen. You had to be Rosa Parks. What if the people of Montgomery did not have a value for the concept of Umoja? Okay? What if the people of Montgomery, instead of having 90% participate, had 50% participation? 50% actually pretty darn good. When we look at our economics, what percentage of black people actually patronize black businesses? What percentage of our dollars stays in our community? It's about 2%, right? So what if 2% had decided, I'm going to participate? Would this have worked? Oh, goodness, no. What if 10%? What if we reverse this? What if 10% of the citizenry of Montgomery who rode those buses decided we're going to stay off of them? And the other 90% said, hey, I got to pick up my kids by a certain time, so I have to take the bus. Would this boycott have been successful? No, it wouldn't have. And this is the boycott in large part that spawned the movement. So when we look at the concept of Umoja and we look at the people who were alive during this movement, many of which are still alive to this day, some have passed on, the deep commitment to Umoja just oozes out of these people who have no face, who have no name, who we do not know, who did this for us. Some of these people are no longer alive. They did this for us, regardless of what we say in the comfort of our own homes, watching Netflix and listening to Tanya talk on YouTube. They did this for us. So let's wrap this up. I just want to take a moment and flash forward to today. I want you all to just close your eyes and visualize some of the things that are happening today. Some of the disputes that we have based on the differences in our political ideology, based on differences of our religion, based on differences of our socioeconomic class, our education, our skin tone, based on ideological differences about a number of things. What happens when we can rally around a concept? Not necessarily all concepts, but a concept. What happens when we can do that? What happens when we can put unity above individualism? What happens? What happens in movements where people were unable to put unity over individualism? What happens? And I'm not going to be specific at this time. I don't think there's a need to be. I'm going to let you use you all's imagination. But I want you to think about this. Keep those eyes closed. I want you to think about the leadership that we do have or have had in our communities. I want you to think about what happens when leaders begin to focus on themselves and make themselves the focus. What happens when leaders fail to recognize that there are others who could also be leaders, who could take a movement, take a cause further than they are able to, for whatever reason? What happens when leaders are able to practice Umoja in the truest sense of the word and put themselves and their interests behind those of their people? Let's talk about real and symbolic victims turned heroines. What happens when someone allows themselves to be put as the face of something? What are they sacrificing? What happens when those people are in disagreement with those who stand behind them as the quote-unquote heroine of a movement? What happens if they tear down those people? What happens if those people tear them down? What happens to that movement? Let's talk about casualties of movement. Let's talk about those who actually had the idea first. Let's talk about those who actually could be the face of a movement or could be the face of an ideology. What happens when those people decide they want to write a tell-all book or put out a video on YouTube about how they were wronged, when in all actuality, it was a choice to make sure that they were not the face because the success of the movement depended on it? Right or wrong? What happens? Think about it. Think about things that you can pull up in your own mind. Collective citizenry. What happens when citizens don't stay in lockstep? What happens when we let our differences turn into quibbles? What happens when we say, well, you know what, forget them or whatever. I'm gonna do my own thing. It's all about me. What happens when that happens? Can we accomplish anything? Probably not. So I say all this to say we are not going to agree at all times. We're not. We are going to have dissension in our viewpoints. And sometimes what happens is that we take that dissension as and we don't really look at who we actually have the most dissension with. We become tribal almost. So who two people, two groups, two entities who have similar goals but differences in opinion on how we get there start to argue, and then the focus becomes the argument and not the mission. So on this day, on the beloved Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, I just wanted to take a moment to really focus on us and how the concept of Umoja that Dr. Martin Luther King emulated, that the Montgomery bus boycott and later the entire civil rights movement emulated, is something for us to use. It's something for us to learn from. It is a teachable moment in history. And if we can take some of these teachable moments that our ancestors and our elders left for us and integrate them into what we are doing or what we try to accomplish, how far could we get? I think we could get pretty far, family. I think we could continue on with this journey that we are blessed to be on this earth to take a part of, and take our place in history and leave a legacy for our children, for them to follow, about how they can use Umoja in the same way. So until next time, Iriheru, Kwaheri, and good night. We are the Nguzu Saba 365.
Kwaheri.